Well, thanks everybody for joining. Brad and I talked a couple weeks ago about what would be a timely topic to bring to parents, and this idea of parental guilt was at the top of my list. I think on almost every conversation I have with parents, the guilt that we all feel, whether it is over uh, just survival right now and allowing our children to be on tech all day so we can get work done, or the guilt we feel when we're considering sending, when you're considering sending your child to treatment. I think we all experience it. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Brad, he's an incredible speaker, author, owner of a very well regarded wilderness program, Evoke. And I know that he's got quite a bit of insight to share with us tonight. So thank you all for being here.
Thanks, Jamie. I'll start off with a couple of things and then I'll kind of pause, and you're welcome to interrupt me as we go too if you have a question for clarification as we go. I can't, like you, I can't think of a topic that relates more to almost everybody that we talk about. I've joked about the fact, this is a true story actually, but a couple of years ago, somebody asked me to come and speak in New York to a financial group. It was something at their yearly meeting where they bring in speakers from various fields, various topics, and they speak to their investors and to their employees and executives, and kind of a gift to give back. And it's not a large group, so the CEO of the company decided he would reach out to a friend of his who runs a women's group where they have a similar kind of yearly meeting. So he was talking to this woman that he knows, this colleague that he knows, and presenting my idea. He had read my book, and she said, "I'm not going to give up an evening and listen to a man talk to us about parenting." And so, first, of course, I was very defensive, and then, of course, as I reflected on that, I think she's right. I think that in our culture, still, and in the dominant culture of the time that most of us are raised who have children, I think there's a different expectation for mothers and fathers in our culture. And so I just want to acknowledge that from the outset that I don't, my value and worth in our culture still is primarily what I do outside of the home. It's not completely that way, but still I lean on that. And my wife would tell you that hers, regardless of whether or not she's working outside of the home, which she does, it's still a great deal of her value in the way that people judge her, perceive her, is on how her children are doing. So I wanted to acknowledge that. The second thing I wanted to really go to is this idea, first of all, of shame in general and guilt in general. And that is, I think we make a big deal sometimes about distinguishing between shame and guilt, and they are different in terms of their intensity. And the psychological adage that's well accepted is shame is feeling bad for who you are, and guilt is feeling bad for what you do. But I think the distinction is almost unimportant because both can tell you, lead you to do the wrong thing. Everybody watching this tonight, everybody listening to this later, it's going to be a podcast later if you want to have it. Um, Everybody can relate to the fact that they can think of at least one thing right off the bat that they would do that would be the right thing to do that they would feel guilty about. Right? Telling the truth to a friend kindly in a difficult situation, setting a boundary with somebody, saying no to somebody. Everybody can think of many examples where they would feel guilt for doing the right thing. So our idea that guilt is somehow tied to morality, to right and wrong, must be debunked, must be challenged. We have to find a new moral North Star, if you will. And so that's the first thing that I would say is, as we struggle with guilt in parenting, I think we really need to look at guilt itself. And a lot of people, when I say this, they say, well, of course, there's healthy guilt and unhealthy guilt. The problem is we don't know how it feels. We don't know the difference between the feeling, right? Like you can say that technically, and all you're saying is sometimes guilt is leading you to do something moral, and sometimes it's not, but the feeling is very similar. So what is guilt? Guilt is, I think most basically, it's an experience of or an anticipation of hurting somebody else, right? Of somebody else suffering because of our choices in some way emotionally. And again, that's not exactly a great moral compass for us because you can think of a lot of things where somebody might get hurt by it, but it would still be the right thing to do. So I think we have to separate our ideas of right and wrong, of good and bad from guilt, and really find a different way, a way of kind of discovering who we are. In my newest book, The Audacity to Be You, I start off with a chapter on becoming a self. That the work of parents, the primary work of parents, is becoming who you are, figuring out who you are, and really unraveling your own childhood and your own background and the messages you have from that context. So I know people like 1, 2, 3-step solutions. I know they like 5 principles and 8 steps and 12 steps, but I think the work is deeper than that. Alice Miller, who wrote, in my opinion, the most important book on child development, called The Drama of the Gifted Child, said that we have only one enduring weapon in our battle against mental illness, and that is the discovery of the unique history of our childhood. So I think we've got to go deep and understand what we were taught. We've got to pull it apart, look at it. And in my experience, that's where therapy or support groups can come in, is we can see our context only when we're out of it, only when we're in a different context. Like the fish is the last to discover water, because you have to know not water to know what water is. And so for us, that means we have to find ourselves in a therapy session or a 12-step support group like Al-Anon or Families Anonymous. And we have to understand that our context, the construct of our upbringing, wasn't the truth. It was a truth, but it was not the truth. And for me, so much of the work with parents is unlearning what we are taught. I'll say one more thing before I kind of pause and for you, Jamie, to ask questions, or for Malia to pass on questions. Recently, I was running we have a new online intensive program. I'm doing our second one this weekend, and I just did our first one. And now we're going to be rolling those out quite a bit during COVID. We'll probably continue after COVID, because some people can make it for an online one where it would be prohibited both financially and for their schedule to travel out to Utah to do it. But as I was working with the mothers during this process, there was a moment, and I was listening to the various pieces of work. These happen to be all mothers. It doesn't have to be that way, but it happened to be all women who had children that have struggled. I said to one of the mothers, I said, it sounds like you're going to have to get used to disappointing people, especially your children. And then that's not something that we're comfortable with. I was giving a presentation yesterday to the folks at Twitter, and I was talking about this idea. They were asking, like, what are the 5 things we can do for self-care? The 3 things we can do for self-care during COVID if we live in a big city, if we can't get out. And I said, I could give you steps like meditation. I could talk about, going online and finding a yoga practice. I could talk about taking a time out in your own space and practicing mindfulness, various activities, online therapy, online support groups, which are abundant these days. But really what's interesting to me is, why don't we do that? You can Google, any of you can Google right now, ideas for self-care, and you're going to see list after list after list of similar examples of self-care. There are going to be very few unique, mind-blowing suggestions. But what's interesting to me is, why can't we or don't we do it? And for me, I think it comes down to, I have a hard time disappointing people. I have a hard time disappointing my children. Disappointing people is critical in expanding your self-care. And if that is something that you struggle with, which I think all of us do, and which ties into parental guilt, it's going to be a battle. It's going to be work for you. And so the idea is this: if you can learn to disappoint people, which sounds funny, if you can learn to disappoint your children, immediately people aren't going to be happy with you, right? They're going to give you what Harriet Lerner says in her book, Dance of Anger. She says they're going to give you change back messages. But at a deeper level, especially your children, what they will know when you're willing to disappoint them is, mom can take care of herself. Dad can take care of himself. And I don't need to take care of them. And the unlived life of a parent, of a mother or a father, is an incredibly heavy burden for a child to carry. The subtitle of my new book is Learning to Love Your Horrible, Rotten Self. And I talk about in the book that if you don't learn to carry around your own horrible, rotten self, your own fallible, imperfect self, if you need to be good, then your children are going to be burdened with your horrible, rotten self. They're going to be burdened with the idea that they have to show up or feel or think a certain way about you so that you feel okay about yourself. So that's kind of my intro into the subject. I don't know if anything comes up for you, Jamie, or if there's any comments or questions from the audience, Malia, that have come up.
Well, I think the idea that it starts with self-care is interesting. And I would also say that so many parents that we work with, self-care has gotten to the bottom of the list because, in the immediate, we have to deal with this crisis. We have to deal with this reaction. Um, we have to make our child okay. And so for parents kind of in a more acute situation, how do we encourage self-care? And I know you just mentioned not loving the idea of step one, step two, but for parents who are feeling overwhelmed, I'm curious what your thoughts are on what's that first step to take.
Well, I'm glad you asked that because it reminds me of something I should have said at the outset, which is showing up today is one way to do it. If you're listening to this, the archived or recorded version of this, or you happen to be watching it live, you're doing it. You're gaining resources for yourself. You're feeding yourself emotionally, spiritually, educationally, psychologically. And when children are struggling, especially in acute situations, you need more resources. Your work, Jamie, when people come to you in crisis, that is self-care. That is, I need help. I can't do it. My child is asking me, obviously, in sometimes some very troubling ways, asking me for things that I apparently can't give him or her. And so they come to you. They show up to an online support group. They listen to a podcast. They read a parenting book. I noticed with COVID that requests for private therapy for me, I keep a case of about 5 or 6, but requests for private therapy for me quadrupled, quintupled, because it was a moment of crisis, right? It's a moment of collective grief and loss. And so people were like, I need that. I was doing okay before, but I'm not doing okay now. So if you don't have a yoga practice, if you don't have a meditation practice, if you don't have a practice of going to therapy during times that aren't red hot crisis, if you're not part of an Al-Anon group or a Codependence Anonymous group, if you don't have a consultant, right? Now is a time to make use of those. So I would say it's finding places where you can unload what's burdening you, or places where you can upload information and resources. And as simple as it is, and I say this to clients all the time in my private practice, right now you're doing it. Right now, you don't have to get it right. You don't have to have the answers. You don't have to feel a certain way. There's no wrong way to do therapy in the way that I think about it. You just get to be you. And how many places are that for you? And when you have a child who's struggling, you're walking a very treacherous path because you're afraid that if you make a misstep that things are going to get worse and somebody's going to be really harmed. So showing up today is as simple as this is. Showing up today is feeding you. I commend, for all of you, and I don't know all of you, I wish your children who may be struggling knew that you went somewhere today to learn about how to be a better you, to how to learn how to be a more complete, more authentic, more courageous you. It's simple things like that. It's simple things of self-care, of reaching out, of getting resources that I think can make a big difference. And acknowledging that is also an important thing.
Thanks for bringing up COVID because I think in this uncharted territory, parents have this added burden or decision to make about, can I place my child during this pandemic? And for a lot of my parents whose children were placed before this, that added layer of guilt that they're feeling that their child isn't home, quote unquote, safe with them. And when we break it down and we talk about it and we realize the implications of pulling a child out of treatment and bringing them home and, what things would realistically look like at home, we can kind of rationalize the decision. But for parents with this there's for sure a real fear out there with COVID going on. Any thoughts just given the current circumstances, and, for those parents who are undecided about placement, for the parents who are really sticking with it, they're seeing, the progress being made, but are losing sleep at night over their decisions.
Yeah. I actually want to read the first question because it mirrors yours that's posted here on the public that Malia's passed on to her, and then answer both of them at the same time because I think they relate. Somebody writes in, after doing my work, gaining insight around why I parented the way I did and feeling guilt in doing so, I now find myself overcompensating for my past behavior with my children. How do I recognize and prevent that? And do you think my children actually recognize that that is what's happening? And I'll talk about the overlap between what you just asked and what this parent is saying.
Mm-hmm.
I point over here because that's the window to the outside world in my office. And there's a real tangible threat out there that most any of us can do very little about. We can social distance, we can wash our hands, we can avoid touching our face, we can wear a mask, right? We can do some things within our control, but none of us have the cure. None of us can fix it, and it's a real tangible threat. And just as it is with your children, substance use, depression, anxiety-related behavior, school refusal, cutting, suicidal threats, those are all very real, potent threats to your serenity.
Mm-hmm.
So my answer is you go somewhere to take care of your fear. The real enemy here is fear. That doesn't mean I'm saying don't be afraid. Doesn't mean I'm saying don't feel guilty. It means you've got to go somewhere to take care of it. I prefer therapy. I've been going to the same therapist for 21 years, and she's not my first therapist. So I go once a week at 11 a.m. Mountain Time. If you try to get a hold of me during that hour, that's why I won't respond. I go once a week to complain, to grieve, to vent my frustration, to share my fear, to lay it down. And she's capable of holding it, compassionately listening to it. So then when I come back to my children, to the decisions I have to make, I'm making it not from a place of fear, because we all know fear is a threat to creativity. We all know threat is a threat, that fear is a threat to our higher level rational thinking, right? It serves a purpose, but if it gets extreme and intense and acute, it blocks our ability to make our best decisions. It hijacks that part of our brain where our best decision making is happening. And so you've got to take care of your fear and your guilt. And you've got to do it outside of the relationship with your child. Because if you don't, you show up to the relationship, to the discussion with your child, to the decision with your child about keeping them in the program or pulling them out or whatever it is. And then those interactions serve to take care of your fear. So you take care of it over here. You come back, you let it inform you, but not drive everything. And then you make the decision with that information. Another piece of it is, I think it's critical that I like this flooding technique. I was just talking to some parents. I can't remember what day it was now, but I was on a Zoom call. It was last night on a Zoom call, our parent support groups. And one of the parents was feeling guilty for having ruined their child, relating to this question that's on our chat box here. And I said, just for a thought experiment, let's assume it's all your fault. What are we going to do? Shall we behead you? Shall we put you in jail for bad parenting for the rest of your life? Like, what's the role of beating yourself up? We all dent our children. We all make mistakes. Enlightened parenting isn't about knowing it all and getting it right all the time and having all the answers and not making a mistake. Enlightened parenting, in my first book, is about what I call accepting your idiot parenting. Once you take away, my mother came to me last year. I had to give a talk. I didn't have to, but I gave a talk. I was invited to give a talk at a conference in Southern California, where I'm from, and my brother invited my mom, which is a horrible idea, to invite your mom to a speech on parenting, right? But I thought I'll just talk fast like I usually do, and maybe she won't catch it all. She caught it all. And she walked up afterwards while my brother and I were hanging out, having hors d'oeuvres and talking to people. And she said, I think I maybe should feel bad for the way I parented you guys, you boys. And I said, well, I think it would be helpful if you recognize the mistakes you make. It would be a gift to us if you knew what they were and could talk about them. It'd be, I think, liberating for you. And I can't take away your guilt, but I don't need it. I don't need you to feel bad. In fact, I said, I think feeling bad will probably get in the way of you knowing what to do. So whether it's fear, Jamie, that you're talking about, whether it's guilt, like this mother is talking about, those are valid responses to situations. They may be evidence of past traumas, but the fact of the matter is you've got to find a practice to take care of them, because if you show up to the relationship, to the decision, having not managed your fear and anxiety, you're going to make decisions and respond to people in service of your fear. And then the child will experience at a conscious or an unconscious level, mom and dad aren't here for me, they're here for them. I need to take care of them, and I'm not doing a good job of it. There's a saying in Al-Anon that says, your serenity is your responsibility. Your serenity is your responsibility. And that is true for parents. It's not your child's responsibility for you to sleep at night. They've got their own life and mess and struggle to deal with. It's your job to figure out how to develop serenity in the context of whatever challenges face you. So I think taking care of yourself by talking to people. Somebody said to me once, well, I went to an Al-Anon meeting and everybody was just complaining. And I said, perfect. It's the perfect place to complain is in an Al-Anon meeting. So I think that's the overlap.
I'm seeing a somewhat related question from another parent, but how do we learn as parents how to allow our children to be uncomfortable? It's so hard to see my child in pain and struggling.
I think
I was reading your first book. A lot of this.
I think, it takes perspective. I talk about learning to tolerate your own empathic misery. In recovery circles, they will talk about healthy detachment. Right? That's a phrase that's been made popular by recovery programs, where you detach from the suffering, you stand in your own circle. What I say is healthy detachment is the same as healthy attachment. Um, Jamie, I think I may have said this to you when I was in Chicago last. Um, there, I was doing a parent meeting, and one of the fathers came with a book of mine that had tabs sticking all out of it, and there was a group of about 30 or so parents, and he said, thank you. This was a great program for my daughter, a great program for me, and this takes years. This takes years. And I said, I'm glad you said it, because it's kind of a big idea to put out there, but to detach yourself from, to develop healthy attachments with children, which is the same as healthy detachment, you have to deprogram yourself. You have to understand the difference between you and other. There's a quote by Gandhi that in my second book, I write a whole chapter about it. It's about love. And I use Gandhi's quote, and I'll summarize a little bit of it because I think it relates. He said, to love other as other, to love another's otherness, you have to take on the responsibility for your own differentiation, your own journey. And then he says, lastly, this heroism to look at yourself is properly called love. So it might seem like a crazy answer, but the solution is to do your work. And I could say that over and over again. Go back and do your work. We know two things about parenting, really. Number one, healthy attachment is the number one thing that you can do for your child to help them develop in their life. Mm-hmm. This is the non-intuitive part of the two things we know, and it's across cultures, and it's every study on attachment. Number two, the number one predictor of your ability to provide a healthy attachment for your child is how much understanding you have of your own childhood. So once you have unraveled the childhood that you grew up with, you start to see other people as other. Gandhi's saying, I can connect and show compassion and differentiation from you only to the extent that I have discovered myself and the relationships that I grew up with. So self-work is the way to detach. And I can give you reframes like healthy detachment is healthy attachment. I can talk about learning to tolerate empathic misery. I can talk about the benefits of allowing others to suffer, so they develop delay of gratification and self-soothing and frustration tolerance. I can do all of that, reframing, and those will give you some epiphany, some idea, something that might help you. But the real fact of the matter is, you do your own work. You unravel yourself, and you're able to see other, as Gandhi suggested.
And I think for a lot of parents in the position of, their child is upset and they're looking to their parent to fix that feeling, make that feeling go away. When you can put it back on them to work through, you're essentially saying to them, you're capable, you can do this, you have the skills. And if you don't have the skills, you've got people around you to help, build those skills. And, it's tough to do. It's tough to work through those feelings of guilt. And yet, if you continue to avoid and rescue and do those things that in the moment may feel good, when you take a step back and see how it's impacting your child and their development and their growth, you may have a different opinion on it all.
Yeah, it can definitely shift your perspective. I think there's an idea, and what you just said reminded me of it. It's kind of complex, but yet at the same time simple and intuitive once you hear it. I read a book many years ago. I don't remember anything from it except for this idea. It was called The Narcissistic Dilemma. And it presented this idea that in previous generations, children worried about what their parents thought about them, right? In previous generations, children were very concerned with whether or not their parents were upset or happy or proud of them. In current generations, the point was made, parents worry about what their children think about them, right? And I think it was this critique of helicopter parenting, of snowplow parenting, right? And I thought about it, and I thought, it's the same people doing the worrying. They just had kids. If you grew up, which many of us did, believing that what your parents thought about you was about you, in other words, most parents on planet Earth that I've met, and all the cultures that I speak to, and I only speak the English-speaking culture, so you can narrow that down a little bit, but every culture that I've spoken to, a principal idea of parents and parenting, people that want to be good parents, is this is how I'm going to parent my child, basically. I'll tell them when I'm proud of them. I'll tell them when I'm happy. I'll tell them when I'm disappointed, frustrated, angry, or scared. Then they will know if they're doing the right thing. If I'm upset, they'll know they're doing the wrong thing. If I'm happy, they'll know that they're doing the right thing. So the child grows up with this process, and then he or she goes out into the world, and then peers and others express feelings towards them. And guess what happens? They think it's about them. I get asked all the time, why is my child so susceptible to peer pressure, and where did that come from? And my answer, in short, is it came from you. You taught them that what you feel is about them. But we know that most of us spend the second half of our lives trying to not base our decisions, our life, who we are, on how other people think and feel about us. And yet we wire that into our children. Mm-hmm. So then you have children, and guess what? The people change, the set design change, but it's still the same play. A child gets upset and you think it's about you. A child is disappointed, you think it's about you. And where did that come from? That came from your narcissistically wounded parents, frankly. And because they passed on that narcissistic wounding to you, not narcissism, by the way, it's just a different thing. They passed on that wounding to you, then you make your children the mirror for who you are. That's why you can't separate. That's why you can't see the child as another. You see the child as a reflection of you. And that's what compromises you so much. So again, the work is figuring out that it was a lie, that your parents' feelings about you had nothing to do with you, that your parents' feelings about you were about them. Bob Dylan, when he was asked in the 1990s about his son Jacob, who had a #1 album, the reporter asked him, well, how do you feel about Jacob's success? And Bob said, it's irrelevant. I could care less. This is the same man who, when he won the Nobel Prize for American literature for songwriting, he said, I'm too busy to pick it up. It doesn't matter to me. And I don't even want the $1 million that comes with it. Like Bob had gotten to a place where it didn't matter what others thought of him, which is part of what made him such a phenomenal artist for many decades. So the work is pulling yourself apart from the idea that what other people think about you, including your parents, is about you. And to the extent that you can do that, then a child can be upset, sad, frustrated, angry, disappointed, hurt. They can feel abandoned. They can feel neglected. They can feel whatever. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a reflection of you. You just see the child is struggling and in pain, and you can be both compassionate and also boundaried with it. And so, again, I kind of want to apologize for going back to a similar theme, but it really does for me go back to your work, go back to figuring out how you were raised. And when parents struggle in my program with concepts, ideas, interventions that therapists want them to do for their children, I always remind our therapists, remember that the parent is just a child with wrinkles and gray hair. You know, like whatever they're not doing that you think that they should do is just the evidence of an unhealed wound. And so if you think about them that way, you can help them to heal. And it won't be condescending. It won't be judgmental. It'll be compassionate, just like the way you look at their children. So I think it's a very similar work to detach, a very similar work to be able to allow our child to struggle and to not see that as a reflection of our parenting. Should we look at some of these other questions?
Uh-huh.
Someone says, I shared the presentation to the Cherry Gulch parent page. You are both such a great resource for our families. Thank you. So that's just somebody trying to make us feel good, which I appreciate. I could use tonight. You want to read the next one?
Yeah. How do you detach, or I'm sorry, what do you mean by healthy attachment? I think I know what that means, but could you talk more, especially in light of the other important idea of differentiation, which at least on the surface seems to be opposites: attachment come together, differentiation becoming a separate self.
Yeah. That question was worded as complicated as the answer. And if you click on, Jamie, if you click on public instead of moderated, you'll see the ones that
Got it. Sorry about
Leah's
that.
passing. That's okay. What I'm saying is detachment is an appropriate awareness of what separates me from you. Detachment is knowing where I begin and where you start, you know, where we each begin and end, which is also what healthy attachment is. It came actually to me when somebody asked me, because I was talking about years ago, I was talking about healthy detachment over the course of several of these webinars, which we do all the time. And somebody said to me, well, when are you going to talk about connection? You're always talking about detachment. When are you going to talk about connection? And I said, well, we'll get to that next time, because I didn't have an answer. So I thought about it for a week, and I go through my thinking process, and I thought, okay, what's the opposite of healthy detachment? And I thought, it's not unhealthy. It's not healthy attachment. That's kind of the same thing. It's unhealthy detachment, right? And then I realized healthy attachment and healthy detachment is an awareness of what it means to be a person and to love another. Simple as that. It is differentiation, which is a word that came up. Dr. Murray Bowen, a family therapy, family systems pioneer in the 1960s and 70s, came up with this word differentiation to define the balance between connection and other. Like, I can be connected to you and I can be separate from you. And can I find that balance? If I'm reactive to you, if I'm dependent on you, if I'm triggered and escalated by you, if your tears are something that I can't tolerate, or your tears cause me to want to run away, right? There's a lack of attachment there. But if I can sit with you in your pain, show compassion, and remain who I am, that's healthy detachment and healthy attachment. Simple, trivial example in thinking about this. I remember We had a Rottweiler that I loved to death. He was my best buddy, Coda. He's passed away. And he thought he was a lap dog. He didn't know that he weighed 125 pounds. So he liked to crawl up on your lap when you were sitting on the couch and sit on your lap while you were watching TV. And we would have to keep him off the couch. And at the time, she was probably 7 years old. She's now 12. She said to me one time, she said, "Dad, it's just not fair that Coda's not allowed on the couch with us." And I said, "I know it's not fair at all, isn't it? Is it? It's just not fair." And she said, "So he can sit on the couch?" And I said, "No." See, she thought because I was showing compassion that my boundary was gone, that I was going to say yes. And that's probably because that's the way I've parented my children, right? I struggle with these same issues. But I was saying, I get it. You're allowed to feel angry. You're allowed to not like it. You're allowed to feel the injustice of it all. And at the same time, I'm going to hold my boundary. That's differentiation in a very trivial example. That's, I'm going to be me, and I'm also going to understand you. And I think people think about a classic situation with a couple where, let's just say the husband is an alcoholic, just to use a cliche. The wife can say, "I love you. I can't live like this. I can't control whether or not you drink, but I can't stay here. And so my boundary is I have to leave, and you can keep drinking. And I care about you." Or she could say, "I know you struggle. I can be here. And I'm going to have my boundaries. If you're drinking, I'm not going to talk to you. If you're drinking and driving, we're going to have a problem." You can set your boundaries and have compassion at the same time. And most people allow their feelings and compassion to compromise their boundaries. We were taught that to have compassion means we have to compromise who we are. And so that's another way of thinking about a lack of differentiation, a lack of healthy detachment, a lack of healthy attachment. So it's complex, but the work kind of brings it into focus the more that you do.
I have a question. I was talking with a parent just today, and they have a young adult child, and the young adult's struggling quite a bit, and we're considering treatment, but obviously he's over 18, and parents are struggling with when my child is struggling, and essentially we're just feeling so guilty for where they're at, and perhaps if we've aided in where they're at and nothing has worked in the past. How do we manage that guilt and still get them the help that we think they need?
The simplest answer is go to Al-Anon. Like you're looking for the 1-step, 2-step, go to Al-Anon or Coda. Guilt is a sign of guilt is a sign of unhealthy upbringing. Guilt isn't the enlightened ones don't feel guilt. In fact, I heard the Dalai Lama speak here in Salt Lake a couple of years ago. He must have made in an hour and a half 10 self-deprecating comments about himself, right? Gandhi, in the famous scene that's depicted in the movie that's based on a real incident, was asked about his success in life, and he went through the success with the British Empire, the success with his own people, and he said, those were he was able to work through. And then he talked about, I've had very little success with myself, which is why I have so much patience for all the other scoundrels in the world. Guilt is a barrier to awareness. Guilt is something to be treated. Guilt is a treatment issue. Guilt is something that you go to Al-Anon for, and you will learn that somebody told you to feel bad for being you. The subtitle of my new book is Learning to Love Your Horrible, Rotten Self. Once you realize that your fallible, imperfect self is okay, it's just human, then guilt doesn't become an issue or a factor. So guilt, like fear, is the enemy. It's not the cure. And this is the craziest thing I see over and over again with anywhere from young students, 13, 14-year-olds that I work with, to professionals that I work with. People think that guilt is the solution. It is the problem. Guilt is a lie. So my answer is, and I probably wouldn't say this, Jamie, if we were meeting with somebody. I wouldn't talk this way if we were meeting somebody, you and I together, because this is a little bit dramatic for that. But in this context, it works. I would say to the group, like, guilt is a treatment issue. If I were writing out a treatment plan and you talked about a lot of guilt, I would say, well, parent needs to work on guilt, because guilt is compromising themselves, their boundaries, their ability to rationally think, their ability to provide what the child needs, right? Guilt is something to be treated and to be worked on, and to develop a practice to eradicate it, or at least keep it at bay. So that's how I would think about it, because I think most people think it's the solution or part of the solution, and it's the exact opposite.
Thanks.
Someone says this: Bella is now at Spring Ridge Academy and doing very well. We transferred her to Evoke, from Evoke to Spring Ridge on March 16th. Bella connected with her first therapist very well, but for a myriad of reasons, her father and I felt very uncomfortable with this therapist for valid reasons. We all made the switch to a new family therapist who her dad and I think is good, but Bella's upset and wants to go back to her old therapist. And it continued, and then this question goes on. Talk about parental guilt. We are apart, COVID, and now she wants to work with a therapist who, while I think is a lovely man, would be like giving my daughter to the care of, say, an herbalist when she has several broken bones. Well, I want to kind of pass the question to you, Jamie, because I know you probably work with this much more than I do. When a parent has some difficulty with the therapist that their child is working with in treatment, and maybe you can give some ideas about how to think through that kind of dilemma that this parent has. What do you say to parents?
I think it's tough to work with a therapist that you don't have a lot of trust in. But I also think it's really disruptive when we're making changes and switching therapists on a kid who's probably had a lot of transition and has probably had a lot of therapeutic connections. And, if they're expressing some sort of connection or productivity, I'd want to have a conversation around where your discomfort lies and specifically what's coming up. And is this something we can talk about and address? Sometimes the solution isn't always changing therapists. And sometimes after digging into it, it is appropriate, but it's hard to weigh in on your particular situation as I'm not familiar. But I think when your child is halfway across the country, the first step is doing whatever you can to build some more trust with the people you're entrusting with her care. And oftentimes that begins by having an open and honest conversation about how you're feeling and why. And, it could come down to misunderstandings. It could come down to pulling in somebody who's been involved previously to, help educate the new team on what's worked in the past and maybe where you're coming from. So there's lots of different solutions to look at.
I like that. I don't have your role, so I'm not involved in that as much as you are. But I always say, talk to when I'm talking to people that come to, for example, our intensives and they have some issue with their therapist, I say, talk to them. I've had problems with therapists in my life, and I've talked to them, and as a result of that conversation, I developed a great deal of trust in, and they were able to say, I think I can help you. Or they gave me I always say this: you deserve intelligent answers to tough questions. Mm-hmm. So if the therapist has an approach that you don't understand or might be skeptical of, you deserve an intelligent explanation about why they're approaching it that way. So sometimes I've had conversations with therapists that I've worked with for me or for my family, and it's led to a tremendous amount of trust and openness. And sometimes I've come to the conclusion this isn't the right person. But like you, it's hard to I think just making a decision without that discussion, bringing in a consultant, if bring in your consultant, bringing in maybe the clinical director or a previous therapist, and getting into the discomfort of having a conversation with a professional where feelings are shared and frustrations are shared and difficult questions have to be asked. I think, like you said, I'm with you. That's a precursor to really making an informed decision about what's the best thing for your family. And then you also have, if you bring in people like your consultant or the clinical director or a former therapist, you also have another reference point, right? You also have somebody else that can say, I'm with you. This is a good time because this is such a vulnerable time. And like you said, trusting somebody is complicated because sometimes people know things you don't. And then sometimes people just aren't right for you and for your family. So I think that hard discussion in one way or another is a really important precursor to making the decision.
Another question that came up, my daughter is in her 8th week at Evoke Entrada and just wrote a letter that seems like it came from week 1. She blamed me for her depression and suicide attempts. She says I lack accountability despite weeks of letters full of reflective listening and owning my mistakes. How can I best cope with the guilt tripping with my own regret and also get to a process of unintentional mistakes, get her to process unintentional mistakes and move on?
Um, the simple answer is I'm going to talk in a way of thinking, not a way of responding for starters. So this is not the literal thing I would say to her, but the answer is okay. I hear you. Thanks for telling me. I'm glad you're talking about it. I'm sorry. I'm doing the best I can, and I know I make lots of mistakes. And I'm glad that you're putting it in a letter, because her putting in a letter is an alternative to it manifesting in clinical symptoms or substance abuse. So you take no resistance to it. I was working with a family a few years ago. I was brought in. It was a local family, actually. I was brought in to be a therapist. The idea was from the consultant was come in and do therapy with this family because they don't want to have to send their child to a wilderness program. So they would bring you in and you could prevent that from happening. So I thought, oh yeah, this is going to work perfectly. So I came in and we were doing great work. And at one point, the young man's behavior was escalating. He was struggling. There was some deception, substance abuse violations, things were getting serious. And in a family therapy session, 4 days before he went to wilderness, by the way, and not my wilderness program, 4 days before he went to wilderness program, we're sitting in their living room, and the young man blows up at his parents and says, "It's your fault. I lied to you, and it's because of you that I lied to you. It's your fault that I lied to you. You've always judged my friends when their hair was too long, when they weren't members of our faith community." And then he went on to list all these reasons when he was younger that his parents would judge them and him and his relationship with them. And he was agitated and escalated and raising his voice. And after 5 minutes or so of venting at his parents, his mother said, "You're right. I did do some of that. Basically, thank you for telling me." And then a few more minutes of discussion and the session was over and he went into the other room. And then the mother turned to me and said, "Yes, Brad, but what about the part of the equation of his accountability? What about his responsibility? How do we teach him to be accountable and responsible for his part of it?" Which was a lecture that was playing in my head while he was blaming his mother, right? I heard the lecture in my head. So she said, "So how do we teach him about that?" And my response was, "You just did. You modeled it. You said you were sorry." I talk about the thesis of my new book is, in this way of thinking, you don't get to be right anymore, but you do get to be a self. And being a self is so much better. So the best way to help your children move through resentment and blame and anger is let it pass through you. Hold your boundaries and let it pass through you, and stop having a discussion with your family members about who's right and who's wrong. And you know what's cool about that? This is the coolest thing about that. If in your family, people are just allowed to think and believe and feel what they feel, and they can have boundaries because they're not right, but they're just them, check this out. They go out into the world and they have peer relationships or relationships with significant others that are toxic and unhealthy. It doesn't feel right to them. So they say to this partner or to this friend, they say, "I don't like this." And the friend, of course, gaslights them and tells them why their feelings are invalid, because that's what people do. And then they say to the friend, "You don't understand. I grew up in a family where I didn't have to be right. I just got to feel what I felt. So I'm out of here. I'm leaving this discussion or this interaction, or in the end, this relationship. So you model for your children what it means to be a self, just be you instead of being right, being human, being fallible, but being you. And then they know how to be a person growing. I want to share this quote, and then I didn't know it would make you disappear on my screen. But it says, I was talking about boundaries on a recent post, and I said, lastly, we can say we are sorry when we fail. Every parent has limits, and every child will discover the end of those limits. We can say sorry when we fall short of the ideal, and with this, the child learns perhaps the most important lesson of all, what it means to be human. So you don't push against it. You let it go through you, and you still hold your boundary, and you still hold accountability, but you don't get to do it from a place of being right anymore.
Another question that came up. I have a note from my reading of The Drama of the Gifted Child, and it's about anger and guilt. Guilt blocks out awareness of anger. I've never thought of guilt as related to anger. Do you have any thoughts on that?
The best book I've read on this topic is The Dance of Anger by Harriet Lerner. It's a great book on boundaries. And she basically says, I think she illustrates the principle best in one story where a woman with children is taking care of her aging father. And she's getting overwhelmed by the increasing requests of his. And she's in therapy with Dr. Lerner. And she comes to the conclusion, she says, I'm going to have to stand up to my father and tell him what I can and can't do. And she said, I realized, essentially, she says, there's two ways out of this place that I'm in. I either have to feel guilt or feel anger. And she says, I don't want to feel anger, so I'm going to have to learn to tolerate the guilt in order to do the right thing. So that's the way out of your dilemmas, feeling guilty or feeling resentful. Self-care, my son, there's a painting right behind the screen. He brought a painting that he had given to me for a present many years ago, and then he wanted to show it in an art show, and then he didn't bring it back. And our house was showing soon, so I said, Jake, I need it. He's an adult at this point. I said, I need it. And he says, I can't bring it. It's too big to fit in my car, and my friend's car that I borrowed isn't in town. So I went into my bedroom, my bathroom where my wife was getting ready, and I started to vent about my ungrateful, entitled, selfish, self-centered son. I pay for his college. I've done this, I've done that. I lent it to him, and now he won't bring it back. And as I heard myself talk, remembering what Dr. Lerner taught, I thought, this is a me problem. My resentment and anger is because I can't take care of myself and feel the guilt. So I called Jake. I said, bring it back, or I'm going to come pick it up. He lived 45 minutes away. He said, fine, hung up. 55 minutes later, he walked into my house, got on a ladder, hung it up on the wall. It's a large painting, hung it up on the wall, got down from the ladder, put the ladder away, and walked out of the house without talking to me. And I thought, that's about right. That's the punishment. And we're fine, the next day or after that. But you have to be willing to tolerate guilt, to do battle with guilt, to stay out of anger and resentment.
How do you detach with a child who has been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and has this continuing feeling of abandonment? It's hard enough to work on the codependency when they see your detachment as abandonment. And I would say that applies to a lot of families, families of adopted children, families of kids who have experienced trauma or divorce or a number of things.
Yeah. I got one for this. In fact, I wrote about this in my new book. I was supervising one of our therapists, and the child was showing borderline features, and we were meeting with this client, this young girl, and she was complaining that the therapist didn't show her enough attention, that she didn't care, and she only did it for the money. And last week she left and abandoned her, even though the therapist said, but I met with you twice last week. You were the only one that I had 2 sessions with. And she said, when you met with me for like 5 minutes the second time. She's like, no, it was more like 30 minutes. And then she said, and by the way, when you were leaving, I saw you laughing with the staff, and I know you were laughing about me, right? So the therapist is having an argument with with the young girl. The therapist is trying to say, I'm a good therapist. I'm not abandoning you. And the young girl is saying, you abandoned me. So I interrupted. And I said, can I say something here? And I said, I think she just needs us to hear how it feels to be her. And there's no way that we're going to be able to fix this feeling in her. So we just need to hear it. And I shared with them a story, shared with the therapist later on a story that I learned about working with borderlines. And this is important, not just with borderlines, but with everybody. It's a mantra that I repeat in my head dozens of times every week in all kinds of circumstances. And it's simple, and it goes like this. You don't get to win. You get to choose how to lose. You don't get to win. You get to choose how to lose. The problem that people get into with borderlines is the people are trying to win. And the game with borderlines and many people is one thing. The game is this. You lose. End of game. They want you to feel as powerless and as helpless as they're feeling. That's the game. So with your children, with your partners, with everybody, it's kind of a mantra that lends itself to a lot of circumstances and relationships. You don't get to win anymore. You don't get to be right anymore. You just get to choose how to lose. In other words, you get to be a self. And that shift in paradigms is so fundamental to so many of us because we want to win. We want to be good.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I say in the book, in relationship to this story, making somebody feel loved is a very different thing than loving somebody. One thing you have control over and one thing you don't. But most of us are unsatisfied when somebody doesn't feel and think the way that we want them to feel and think. So you learn in this work to express love and authenticity and courage, and you learn to let go of how the other person receives it. You can listen to their feedback, consider it as information, but you learn how to lose. At the very end of the book, I have 3 tools or gateways to enlightenment. And the last one in the book is learn how to lose and get good at it. I think we're near the end of the hour, so we might have time for one more, Jamie, or any other thoughts that you have.
I'll read one more question. After a tough divorce, I felt guilty that I showed emotions, and my boys may have taken some of that on. I even think that they get their emotional problems from me or my side of the family. My 2 are going through a lot of self-work. Any thoughts about my guilt around this?
Again, I would say I've already admitted that I've been to therapy with my current therapist for 21 years. So I'm not speaking from a pedestal, but you go to work and take care of your guilt there.
Yeah.
Guilt is a toxic idea, a toxic message, a toxic dynamic that's passed on through the generations that we were told had something to do with being a moral, upstanding, good person. And it's nonsense. It's just nonsense. So did you dent your children? Absolutely. Everybody dents their children.
We all do.
Some more, some less. And so you learn to separate out guilt and shame from awareness. And you learn, when you know you're okay, because you end up re-experiencing yourself with a therapist or a support group that just sees you and understands that any wound that you have that you passed on, you came by honestly. I remember years ago in another life, I was meeting with a church leader and I was getting a divorce. And he said, the sins, my 2 older children are from my first marriage. And he said, just so you know, the sins, your soon to be ex-wife is a good person, which he wasn't wrong about. And he said, so your sins are going to be on their heads. And I wasn't trying to be a smartass, but I thought about that and I thought, well, my dad was really not a very good dad, so I'm just going to pass them up to him. What's the point? The guilt is just about control. It's just about trying to control other people. It's nonsense. And my dad is flawed. He was imperfect. And I know his story and I know how he was injured from his father. And I don't know my grandfather's story, but I can imagine he was injured from his parents. And I injure my children. and they will hurt their children. And so, in a really compassionate, loving, I'm with you kind of way, we got to get over the guilt. And the only way I know how to do it is sit and re-experiencing yourself in a 12-step group with a sponsor or a therapist or a capable, empathic other, and you come to learn that you're okay, that you're human, and that that doesn't make you bad. Like Kahil Gibran says in the book The Prophet, under good and evil, you are good when you give of yourself, and you are not evil when you take.
Thanks, Brad. I'm just going to read one more comment a parent just shared because I think it wraps this time up nicely. Thank you for this time. I love showing up and just getting to be me and not being right or wrong. Truly inspiring. And thank you to all of the parents who have showed up tonight. I hope you found some of this helpful. If there are other things you want us to cover, certainly feel free to reach out and we can get something else organized. Brad, anything to add?
No, just thank you, Jamie. Thank you for doing this. And honestly, all the respect and love in the world for everybody who showed up here to to consider looking at themselves. So I just have all the respect in the world because some people stop, some people arrive, and you folks haven't arrived. And I have all the respect in the world for people who never arrive.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care. Bye bye.